Let's take a word problem and we're going to see if we can convert that problem into an equation and then use the equation to find a value. So this problem says science on a sphere, SOS, demonstrates the effect of atmospheric storms, climate changes, and ocean temperature on the environment. The volume of a sphere is 4/3 of pi multiplied by the radius r to the third power. And the first thing we need to do is write an expression that represents the volume of a sphere. Well, the volume of a sphere is given to us in this very last sentence. The volume of a sphere is. So, is in math means equals. So we need something that says the volume of a sphere equals. And then we're going to do 4/3 pi multiplied by the radius r to the third power. Now, when we have a problem like this, the first thing we do is define our variables. And so that's what we're going to start off by doing is we're going to define the variables. Meaning, what are the things in this problem that we don't know? One of the things we don't know is the volume of the sphere. That's what this equation is going to tell us, the volume of a sphere. So our first variable we're going to define is going to be whatever variable we plan to use for volume of a sphere. I think it makes sense to use V for volume. So V is going to be the volume of a sphere. And the second variable is actually given to us by the problem. It says pi is multiplied by the radius r. So r is going to be the radius of a sphere. So this is going to be an equation where we take the radius of a sphere, we plug it in, and it gives us the volume. And the reason we know it's going to give us the volume is because of that part I underlined in red that says the volume of a sphere is. Is means equals. So volume of a sphere is going to be V equals. Okay, what comes next after that? Well, after that, it says 4/3 of pi. So 4/3 is just an improper fraction. 4/3. And of means multiplication of pi. A lot of problems will tell you to use 3.14 for pi or 22/7 or something like that. This problem doesn't. It doesn't tell us what to use for pi, so we're just going to use the pi symbol. So 4/3 pi. And then what are we doing with that 4/3 pi? Well, then it says multiplied by the radius r. Multiplied by the radius r means times r. And then the very last thing says to the third power. So it's r to the third power, which is r with an exponent of 3. So what we've written here, v equals 4/3 times pi times r to the third power, is the equation for the volume of a sphere. But all of our operations here are multiplication. So we could write it just like we did right here, but also we don't have to write the multiplication symbols because of implied multiplication. If there is no symbol, that means we are multiplying. So this is a much more common way to see the volume formula written. And in fact, if you look at your formula chart, this is what it says on the formula chart for volume of a sphere. Okay, so now that we've written the equation, the next piece of the problem is asking us to use the equation. It says find the volume of the 3-foot radius sphere used for SOS. So it's telling us that the radius is 3, the 3-foot radius sphere. This means R is going to be 3. Okay, so all we're going to do is take this volume formula that we have, V equals 4/3 pi r to the third power, and we're going to replace the r with 3. So we've got V equals 4/3 pi, and right here where the r goes, we're going to put 3. 3 to the third power. And now we're going to follow our order of operations. The first thing in order of operations is grouping symbols. We do have a set of parentheses, but there's nothing in the parentheses for us to do. We just have a number 3 there. We can't do anything with the 3, so we move on to the next part of order of operations, which is to do the powers or the exponents. And we do have one of those. We've got 3 to the third power, which is 3 times 3 times 3. And 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. This is 3 times 3 is 9, and 9 times 3 is 27. So after our first operation, we've got v equals 4 thirds pi times 27. So there are two different ways that we can get the answer to this problem. One of the ways is that we can go ahead and do 4 thirds multiplied by pi. Doing 4 thirds multiplied by pi is going to give us a horrible decimal because pi is an irrational number. So if we had a calculator, we could do 4 thirds times and then use the pi button on our calculator to get a really accurate answer. But we can get an even more accurate answer if we just don't ever multiply by pi. What I mean by that is, let's write our answer with pi in it. So instead of doing 4 thirds times pi, let's do 4 thirds times 27. First thing we need to ask ourselves is, are we allowed to do this? Are we allowed to change the order? And instead of doing the first two things, 4 thirds times pi, are we allowed to change the order and do 4 thirds times 27? Order of operations says do multiplication from left to right, and we're kind of breaking the rule here. We're not going left to right. Left to right would be 4 thirds times pi. We want to do 4 thirds times 27. Does the order matter when you're multiplying? Well, we can test that with a really easy example. What is 4 times 2? Well, 4 times 2 is 8. What happens if I change the order? If instead I decide to do 2 times 4, will I still get 8? So when we are multiplying, the order doesn't really matter. If you're multiplying and dividing at the same time, order absolutely matters. But if we're just multiplying, we can multiply in any order we want to. So the answer is yes, we can just do 4 thirds times 27. 4 thirds times 27 is really not that bad, believe it or not. 4 thirds times 27 is the same thing as 4 times 9. And the reason for that is 4 times 27 thirds is the same thing as 4 thirds times 27. Again, the order doesn't matter when you're multiplying. So this 27 I can write as 27 over 1. So on the top, I would do 4 times 27, and on the bottom, I would do 3 times 1. But the order doesn't matter. So on the top, I can do 4 times 27, and on the bottom, instead of doing 3 times 1, let's do 1 times 3. You may be wondering, why in the world would you do that? Why would you switch it like that? And the reason is because this 27 thirds reduces. 27 divided by 3 is 9. So what I'm left with here is 4 over 1, which is just 4, times 9. And 4 times 9 is going to give me 36. Okay, so my volume problem was 4 thirds times pi times 27. We then did this in a different order. We did 4 thirds times 27 times pi. And when we did 4 thirds times 27 just now, we got for our answer 36. "36 pi is what is called an exact answer. 36 pi is the exact answer, meaning I have not rounded my answer. If I actually multiply 36 by pi, if I type in 36 times pi into the calculator, I'm going to have to round my answer because pi is a decimal that goes on forever. So if I multiply by pi, my answer will also be a decimal that goes on forever, and I'll have to round it. There's nothing wrong with rounding an answer sometimes, but this is the exact answer. The unrounded answer is 36 pi. If I really needed to know what the decimal was, I could, of course, do pi times 36, and I could get an approximation, but it is just an approximation because pi isn't really 3.14. 3.14 is a rounded version of pi. I was talking while I was doing that, so hopefully my multiplication is correct. You can double check me, make sure I multiplied that right. 113.04 is a perfectly good estimate for what it is, but it is just an estimate. So if I want to know exactly what the answer is, I write 36 pi. And if I want an approximate answer, I write 113.04, assuming I multiplied all that correctly.